I call Kelvin Davis.
Mr Chair, Clause 5 is titled Meaning of Whanganui Iwi Historical Claims, and I'd just like to read this part. In this Act, Whanganui Iwi Historical Claims means every claim, whether or not the claim has arisen or been considered, researched, registered, notified or made by on the date on which the deed of an on-account settlement becomes unconditional under Clause 6.1 of that deed, that Whanganui Iwi had at or at any time before that date or may have had at any time after that date. And I think that's really important, Mr Chair, in that we're talking about settling all the claims. Now this goes back to what I was saying earlier in the debate about the preamble. We need to settle all the claims so that Māori can actually move away from grievance, so that we can move ahead in our lives and not always be looking back. And so I believe that Clause 5 is a very telling part of this bill. It says it's going to settle every claim from Whanganui Iwi, and I believe, Mr Chair, that is very significant. Mr Chair, Part 1 is where we see throughout Part 1 the word Whanganui has been changed to Whanganui, and that in itself is extremely significant. Now, to many people listening and watching, they'll still be asking themselves, now what is this big issue about the letter H being included in the word Whanganui to make it Whanganui? Mr Chair, this just recognises that Māori have for a long time been marginalised, and this is putting this little bit of history right for the iwi of the Whanganui. Now, I think the time is long since come and gone where Māori need to apologise or ask permission for our language to be spoken correctly, written correctly, pronounced correctly. And this bill rectifies the decades, the centuries of the past decades and the past century where the word Whanganui has been used instead of Whanganui. Now, in the Māori language, there is no such word as wanga. That sounds more Aboriginal than Māori. In my understanding, whanga means a bay, and a whanganui means a large bay. There's no such thing as a large wanga, whatever that may be. The other meaning of the word whanga is to have to wait, and you could say that whanganui means a long wait or a big wait, and the people of Whanganui have had to wait a long time for the wrongs of the past to be righted. Now, it's impossible. I remember a kuia up north saying that when she hears a Māori word, she can visualise the word in her mind, and she actually sees a picture rather than a word. And she said, you can't actually see a wanga because it doesn't exist. And that is basically saying that that Whanganui, as the iwi of Whanganui know it, doesn't exist, and it denies their history, and in itself is worthy, I believe, of, if not a grievance, then certainly anger at being marginalised. And I believe that this bill, throughout where the word Whanganui has been changed to Whanganui, actually rectifies that little grievance. Now, there's also another word in there that we've mentioned, Kaitoke. And it'd be interesting to get an understanding of where the word Kaitoke comes from, because as we all know, as New Zealanders, kai means food or to eat. But I would guarantee that most people don't understand what toke means. And where I come from, a toke is a worm. So there's a bit of history there, I guess, and a bit of a story that remains untold to the wider public of New Zealand, that somewhere along the line somebody has been eating worms, and I bet that it sounds quite gross actually, but I would say that there's actually a very deep and meaningful legend and story behind that deserves to be told and shared, and I believe that in schools. that we need to... Mr Chair?
Kelvin Davis.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I'll just be brief, but I believe in schools that these legends and these stories about the naming of areas and the history associated behind it should actually become part of school curriculum, so that actually being Māori and the Māori way of life isn't strange to New Zealanders, but it's shared with all New Zealanders, and all school kids just grow up understanding a Māori perspective on historical areas and events in their geographic region. And I think that would do a lot to break down the misunderstandings and the tensions that arise simply because people don't understand the Māori perspective, the Māori point of view. And I go back to something I've mentioned in this House before, that New Zealand is like a river, and on one bank is the Māori part of New Zealand, and on the other bank of the river is the non-Māori bank of the river. And the Treaty of Waitangi, which I've mentioned in the preamble, is a bridge that connects the two sides. And over the decades and the centuries, most Māori have actually crossed that bridge and stepped into the non-Māori side of New Zealand and understand the language and the customs and the ways of doing things. And the question has been asked, how many non-Māori have crossed over onto the Māori side of the bank and seen New Zealand from our point of view? Now, some, but not many Pākehā have crossed over. Just about every Māori in New Zealand has crossed over and understands and feels confident in walking on the Pākehā side or the non-Māori side of that river. So with that, Mr Speaker, I'd just like to close up, but just reiterate that it's great that under Clause 5 this is looking to settle all Whanganui Iwi historical claims. Kia ora.
Mr Chairman.